Today's video is sponsored by Ground News, of whom more in a bit. Something occurred to me the other day. I'd love to say that it was some amazing revelation, but actually it's incredibly well known and not even remotely obscure. The thing that occurred to me is that it's possible to get from Bond Street to Stratford directly via 3 different routes. Then I decided to stretch that one thought out into an entire video because sometimes the creative process is a straight line. The 3 routes are the Central Line, the Jubilee Line, and the Elizabeth Line. 2 tube lines and a technically not a tube line but some people count it as one anyway railway line. The story of how and why these particular stations should have 3 direct services between them is a complicated one. So let's take a ride and talk about it. I took the oldest journey first. That is, Bond Street to Stratford via the Central Line. Bond Street was built by the Central London Railway in 1900. It actually opened in September that year, about 3 months after the rest of the line. Basically, the CLR originally wanted to put the station on Davies Street, which was allowed on condition that they also paid for street improvements. Negotiations over this failed and they chose a new station site instead. Ironically, there is now a station entrance for the Elizabeth Line on Davies Street. Originally, the CLR ran from Shepherd's Bush to Bank. Bond Street was an obvious destination. Then, as now, it was an upmarket shopping district. The CLR made much of the fact that it served the shops of the West End. They advertised to all walks of life, and their 2-penny flat fare was affordable for all but the very poorest residents of London. The rich visited Bond Street to buy the latest luxury goods, and the poor came to window shop. Not so different from today, really. When Harry Gordon Selfridge opened his American-style department store on Oxford Street, he even tried to persuade the CLR to rename Bond Street to Selfridge's. These days, Bond Street is so synonymous with shopping that it actually has a shopping mall at its entrance. Stratford is a more complicated story. Stratford Station is in East London. It's a truly enormous station, served by the Overground, the Docklands Light Railway, Greater Anglia, the Elizabeth Line and the Underground. It even has a steam locomotive, albeit in quite a sorry state these days. It used to have its own engine shed and even had its own railway workshop, building and repairing engines and rolling stock for the lines of East Anglia. But why? Why here, of all places? Well, in the early days of the railways, everyone wanted to get to London. But land in London was ridiculously expensive, and landowners were often not too happy about a railway running across their estate, so what often happened was that companies would make a deal to share routes into the city. In 1839, the Eastern Counties Railway opened the first section of their line out of London, which passed through Stratford. In 1840, the Northern and Eastern Railway arrived, and Stratford was a convenient place to build a junction with the Eastern Counties. Then they ran over the Eastern Counties line into Bishopsgate. Because there was a junction, and because the area was not very developed, this became a convenient place to build a shed and the railway's works. There being a junction, a shed and a railway works here, other lines were built to serve Stratford. In 1862, several East Anglian railways, including the Eastern Counties and the Northern and Eastern, merged to form the Great Eastern Railway. The Great Eastern Railway built even more lines, including a new one from Bishopsgate to Liverpool Street. By the early 20th century, the lines into Liverpool Street were badly congested. Basically, just about every passenger train serving the east of England passed through Stratford, from luxury boat trains to overcrowded workmen's trains. In 1935, London Transport announced a plan to relieve this by extending the Central London Railway, soon to be renamed the Central Line, through East London to Stratford, where it would take over the branch line to Ongar and the Fairlop Loop. These trains could thus bypass the main line between Stratford and Liverpool Street, and their passengers could get into central London without changing trains. The scheme was carried out in stages, fully opening in 1949. At Stratford, if you know what you're looking for, you can kind of tell that the Central Line was a late addition. It just sort of pops up at two separate platforms in the middle of the station. Now, the three different routes between these stations may not be news to you, but I'll tell you what will be news to you, and that's the news. That's why I'm partnered once again with Ground News. Ground News is a news aggregator that helps you see the full picture. Let me show you what I mean. Take this story about a recommended public sector pay rise. We see that more outlets that are considered right-wing are covering it than on the left. But we can also see in detail what's being said. Rocket News, which leans left, talks about the fact that the rise is above the level of inflation. Meanwhile, the Daily Express, which is on the right, focuses on dissatisfaction with the raise and directly attacks the government. The facts in both reports are the same, but you'd get a very different idea of the story depending where you look. You can also see who owns which outlets and how reliable they are, which is very handy at a time when news and propaganda are hard to distinguish. You can take things further with the blind spot feature, which shows which stories are being ignored by either the left or the right wing. If there's a particular subject you're interested in, you can also create a custom feed. For instance, I need to know what's going on in London, so I add that to my custom feed, and there you have it. If you follow my special little link, that is ground.news/Jago, or just use that QR code down there, you can get 50% off the Vantage subscription. That's the one I use, which includes all the features I mentioned before, and much more. And now we return to Stratford. I made my way over to the Jubilee Line platforms for my journey back. The Jubilee Line came much later than the Central Line. The section with Bond Street opened in 1979. The section with Stratford 20 years later. As you might have gathered from the Central Line business, a lot of the developments on the Underground after about 1930 came about in order to sort out the mess created by railway builders up until about 1930, and the Jubilee Line was no exception. During the planning stages it was known as the Fleet Line. The genesis of the Fleet Line is very, very complicated, but long story short, by the Second World War the underground lines in central London were overcrowded and South London had very poor connections to the Underground. The Fleet Line took a number of proposals for new lines from the 1940s and amalgamated them into a new tube that would take over the Bakerloo line services from Stanmore to Baker Street, then head to Charing Cross, along a new tunnel. That opened in 1979 and includes Bond Street. I rather like the themed murals on this section of the line. At Bond Street there's a parcel to represent shopping. After that, the aim was to run to Fenchurch Street via Fleet Street, hence the original name. Then from there, well, they weren't exactly sure. Back in the 1940s, the idea was to go to southeast London, probably to Lewisham. By the early 1970s, priorities had shifted. The docks were in terminal decline, and building a tube line to serve the old docklands was seen as a means of stimulating economic growth and regenerating the area. That didn't happen, at least not then. The Docklands Light Railway was built as a low-budget compromise. By the late 80s, the priority had shifted again. A massive new commercial centre was being built in the Docklands, Canary Wharf. The developers, Olympia and York, felt that the DLR would be inadequate and proposed their own private line from Waterloo to Westcombe Park via the Isle of Dogs. This would have had possible extensions to Stratford and the West End. But the cost would be very high, so they came to London Transport to ask if they would be willing to help. London Transport agreed to a modified version. This one would be an extension of the Jubilee Line. It would not go to Westcombe Park, but it would instead run through South London to Stratford, improving connections in South and East London. The scheme wasn't perfect. London Transport weren't too happy about having to abandon the Jubilee Line station at Charing Cross, but on the whole it was the best of both worlds. The new extension opened in 1999 from Green Park to Stratford, and now there were two ways to get between Bond Street and Stratford, which had the additional benefit of taking a bit of strain off the heavily used Central Line. But it wasn't enough. London is a big and densely populated city, and the transport network is under constant strain. Even with the Jubilee line, the Central line still struggled to cope with the large number of people needing to travel between East and West London. The scheme that would become the Elizabeth line was proposed in the 1940s. As a matter of fact, at the same time as the schemes that would become the Jubilee line. In the 1974 London Rail Study Report, a tunnel was proposed from Paddington to Liverpool Street. At this time, the concept was known as Crossrail. There were other aspects of Crossrail that were added and removed over time, but the basic concept of an east-to-west tunnel stayed basically as it was. Because taking pressure off the Central line was a major priority, it made sense that both Bond Street and Stratford were on the line to provide a shortcut for passengers. For various reasons, mostly to do with money, the Crossrail project took a long time to get off the ground. Actually, it wasn't approved until 2008 and didn't open until 2022. The line opened in May, but Bond Street was delayed until October for a number of reasons. There were difficulties tunnelling in the area, the fire protection systems had to be redesigned in the wake of new regulations coming in, and the original contractor left the project in 2020. In some ways it's a weird echo of the situation in 1900, which feels like the kind of strange psychogeographical thing Ian Sinclair would write a book about. Or it's just a coincidence. Whatever. What's not a coincidence is that at Stratford, as with the Central line, the Elizabeth line takes over another mainline suburban route. In this case, the busy line to Shenfield. As a result, the platforms here are, like those of the Central line, old platforms repurposed. The three different sets of platforms at Bond Street represent the different ways of thinking about what transport in London meant when they were built. The Central line platforms were built at a time when tube trains were fairly new technology. The white tiling highlights the cleanliness and modernity that was one of the Central London Railway's big selling points. The Jubilee line platforms have a very 70s look to them, with the modern murals and bright orange panelling adding a bit of brightness to contrast with the line's grey colouring. The Elizabeth line platforms are long, broad and airy, future-proofed against overcrowding. Almost as if the designers were saying, well, we're not going to do this a fourth time. As for Stratford, well, the platforms have been put basically wherever made the most logical sense at the time. Stratford is a confusing station, and I'll be honest, no matter how often I use it, I always need to refer to the signs to figure out where I'm going. So there you have it. 3 routes between Bond Street and Stratford via 3 different lines. It's certainly not the only multiple-choice route in London, but I think you'd be hard-pressed to find 3 routes that contrast more. Well, I do hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please do leave a like and consider subscribing for more. Are there any other journeys you can take by 3 or more direct routes? I can think of several with 2, but 3 is a little trickier. At least if you ignore routes where 2 or 3 lines share track. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section. Who knows, maybe I can do this again with other destinations. I would like as ever to thank my donors on Ko-fi, on Patreon, and here on YouTube for your generous support. You are the fast train to my overcrowding. I'd also like to thank Ground News for partnering with me once again. Check out the link in the description below to take advantage of their generous offer. And I will see you all again very soon. Cheerio.